Hey Enneagram friends, I'm Abby, an IEA accredited Enneagram teacher and certified somatic practitioner. My work has always been an invitation for greater self-awareness and really a compassionate curiosity for the world. And I offer that invitation through corporate Enneagram workshops, private coaching, and educational resources like this podcast. In this season of the podcast, I'm inviting fellow Enneagram teachers, authors, and practitioners into the podcast space to share with you about personal growth, all through the lens of their personal type structure. Today on the podcast, I speak with Alicia Divers about her experience in personal growth, all through the lens of her type structure as an Enneagram 8. Let me share with you just a little bit about Alicia before I invite you into our conversation. So Alicia is a spiritual director who's also certified in the narrative Enneagram tradition, as well as in somatic attachment therapy. So Alicia and I met years ago in our certification process through the narrative Enneagram. And it's been a gift to know her and to walk alongside of her as we've kind of shared in some similar spaces with our somatic therapy and through the Enneagram training, but then also to see the areas that she's exploring that are very different than mine in her work as a spiritual director. So I'm excited for you to get to listen in into our conversation. And my hope is that you will take away new understanding, new language to better explain yourself if you lead with type 8, or to have a more compassionate lens for the 8s in your life that you are living with and learning to work with and collaborate with. My hope is that you'll listen to this episode with a lens of compassion for the 8s in your world. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for saying yes to being on the podcast. Thanks for a conversation and being able to talk through some of the pieces. It's a gift to get to have you here, so thanks.
Well, thanks, Abby.
Yeah. So, as I've been going through this series with lots of different teachers and authors and practitioners, it's been a lot of cold calls. It's been a lot of me sending an email and hoping, the person on the other end responds. But it feels so fun to get to have you on the podcast because we actually know each other.
I know, it's so great.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
So although we've never actually met in person, we spent a lot of time in conversation, just from our program and our 8 Queens chat that we've started with our fellow 8s that we collected along the way. So that feels kindred to get to share a space in the podcast episode too. So we are exploring growth. There's lots of things that we could talk about, and we could talk about all the numbers, but we're going to instead just focus on type 8, and really an invitation to reflect on personal growth, both in previous seasons, but then also some of those pieces of what it looks like now in that slow evolution that we are always a part of in our growth. And so, if we can kind of start our conversation just with, how did you land on type 8? When you were discovering the Enneagram, did you kind of stop along different points in the diagram, or did you kind of know pretty quickly you were an 8? So what was that process like for you?
So I don't know how it was for you, Abby, as an 8, but I feel, and other 8s listening, I don't know if 8s get the luxury of not knowing their Enneagram type. I feel like there's several people you should look into the Enneagram and you might be a type 8. So I feel like by the time I got to the Enneagram, there were a lot of people pointing to the fact that I was an 8. And the minute I read it, I was like, okay, yes, this is me. So I feel really grateful. And it's probably also a very 8 trait to know very quickly what you are. And so I didn't ever really have a season of knowing if I was an 8. I will be honest and say some of the language, though, around 8 took me the more self-awareness I did to really understand the power dynamic and control aspect. Because I would talk to friends you're not really a controlling person, or I don't see you as someone that's in those spaces. So I feel in some of that evolution, though, is that there is I don't do that. And then one day it clicks and you're like, oh my gosh, I am the definition of that. And so I didn't really have a season where I got the ignorance of not knowing my type. So.
Oh, I love that. Well, and when I discovered the Enneagram, it was, not early in the conversation, right? Because it's been around for decades, but in the Western world, but really early on in the wave. And so when, it was before The Road Back to You came out. That always feels like the wave in my mind of people becoming more familiar.
Of
And so I
course.
didn't have that experience of people telling me. There was like a gentle like, hey, this is something that I really like. You might like it too. And she did what she was supposed to do, which was not tell me my type. Even I should go back and ask her if she knew.
Oh yeah.
But I actually, when I first learned about it, I learned through reading a book, Richard
Mm,
Rohr's book, and I thought I was a
mm.
five just by self
Oh,
preservation eight has all the five tendencies. It wasn't until I went to a workshop and then I heard someone describe an eight for the first time, and I was like, oh gosh, okay, that's actually where I land. And then I never really like waffled. It was like, okay, we have me pegged, and this is where we're heading. So,
yes.
yeah.
It's a painful identity sometimes. People have very strong opinions about eight, rightfully so, but there's
Mm-hmm.
people have thoughts about us. So
Yes, for sure. And I think, as we interact with all the types, there's always like these hidden insecurities about your type, right? Whether it's like,
hmm
all this information about me. Now, how do you feel about that? And so we get it just like the other types. Yeah.
that's true. Although I feel like most states are like, we love being eights.
Yeah. And that's the
There's a
beginning part
fun
of the journey.
we yes, we love it. We love being eights. We love where we are. And then we see
Yeah.
the dark side shortly after.
Yeah,
So
for sure. I know. One, and I often feel that way about sevens too. My husband's a seven, which he will always
mm.
jokingly say to people, like, come back when you hate your type, and then we'll actually talk about the Enneagram together.
Oh
But like
yeah.
that sobering moment of like, ooh, like this
Oh,
is actually what it is. And then you
absolutely.
start to accept it and love it, right? But it's just that,
hmm
yeah, that turning point.
hmm
So, when you
Absolutely.
first learned about your type and in some of these early on conversations, what was kind of the initial pieces that felt like maybe really sobering to have some language around? Like it felt like there was a lot of instant, like awareness or kind of like jump started that conversation around
Mm.
awareness of your type.
I found the Enneagram in a season, which I think is so many people with Enneagram, when I was just in a kind of a dark season of my life. As everybody loves to use the Enneagram language, unhealthy season, which trying to move away from that phrase. And I think what's so interesting about AIDS is we're so blind to some of our impacts that we have. I remember when I was in college, I had a coworker of mine, and she was like, "You have the ability when you step into a room or a meeting that you set the pace and temperature for like how it goes." And I was like, "That's ridiculous. Like I'm nice. Like I don't understand that." And I think one of the biggest kind of sobering pieces is that I began to realize that my ability to be in a space has direct impact on other people. That even when I'm not trying to make impact, I'm making impact. And so I began to think through all of the seasons of my life where people have said that. And it never really resonated with me. I never understood it because a lot of mates are like, we're nice, we're friendly. Like, what are you talking about? Like, like, I have all the two qualities. And so I think we're just very unaware. And even now, when I'm aware, people are like, you still make big impact. I'm like, I'm not even trying to make impact in a space. It's just, it's that kind of energy that we give off. And so I think that was really sobering for me. And then really, honestly, all around our defense mechanism of this impulsivity of just how quickly we move forward and how quickly we make decisions and that kind of visceral feeling in our bodies to just move through something very quickly. And so I feel like um, really those two things were really big for my understanding of what it meant to be an eight and kind of how those are more challenging to be on the other side of people experiencing you. I think is really some sobering things for me. So
Yeah, for sure, for sure. It's interesting even in saying some of that sobriety came from realizing how others like were impacted or perceived,
mm-hmm.
and especially for that first piece, right, of the impact. And I think for some types, like the invitation is to stop being so concerned about others and to really like have some more awareness on self. But with eights being so self-referencing, it's like that moment of really grasping what it feels like for the other person in this space. It's like once you see it, it's hard to unsee it again.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just
Yeah.
tremendous amount of compassion that comes from it.
Yeah. And I think also this is just kind of fun like realization. I don't know if other eights experience this, but I always have two ways people experience me. Either like super warm and lovely, and other people, especially in work life, if you have more of a presence places, I'm also very like cold and intimidating. And it was such a binary, which is so much within the eights. And It was the first time I was able to describe, like I used to joke, like, well, just give me like my third impression. I'm really great if you meet me. But I've had my entire career, my life be like, you're so different than who I thought you were. But then other people would experience this really warm space if I was like felt very trusted or trusted the space and was in it. And so it was like actually really helpful for me to be like, this is how I come across, sometimes very serious, intimidating, but I don't feel that way. Like usually I'm intimidated by something and people are experiencing me very differently. And so it's helped me kind of understand even how I'm perceived, that I have kind of these two binary worlds. And depending on how comfortable and trusting I feel in a situation, or I'm like, I don't know you, like, being able to kind of move through that, I think is really helpful. And that kind of early on is how, again, how people are perceiving me in two very different ways and very extreme ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then being able to kind of put language around that was really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and even, we talk about with eights, like just that all or nothing quality, right?
Yes.
And I think that, like, I mean, even just thinking about my own experience, that being so illuminating of like, with that eight energy, you saying nothing is not you blending in, right? Like,
No,
I mean, and that was
it's
a
like a
really hard
statement.
thing. Yes, it was a statement of like, I mean, even I remember having this moment of realizing like, and maybe someone described it this way, but of like when you don't say something, it feels like a shark is in the water and we're just waiting for it, right? And even if you still don't say anything this entire meeting, especially thinking about like working in higher education before this work now, but
Hmm.
just so many moments of like there being this tension around me not saying anything. I'm
Hmm.
like, I'm trying to blend in. I'm trying to step back. I'm trying to
Yes.
not whatever. But that intensity is still speaking volumes, even if
Hmm.
you've withheld your words around it. And so that can be
Yeah.
really, it can be really tricky to
Yeah.
navigate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that same intensity of like impacts. And for me, like I've always been really shy. As a kid, I didn't talk a lot. Like I'm really naturally shy. And so for me, it's funny because I think it's that point of connection. People really want to connect and it's like that shyness for me. And so it's so funny because I'm like, I'm actually just shy. Like I assume you don't want to get to know me. Like I'm just, for me, it's like a connection, which makes me as a good growth. Like I need to, my face needs to look that I want to connect more. And maybe actually as an eight, I don't really want to connect more, but at least I can move in that space of like realizing the body language. Sorry, that's my radiator.
Oh,
I
you're
live in New
okay.
York and that is, okay, I'm like, that is a very loud noise that my radiator is making. And so, yeah, so it's so interesting when you begin to put these pieces around the type eight. It's very interesting.
For sure. So, when you think about this impact piece, both before when you first got some language for it, but maybe even now in this season, like
Mm-hmm.
what are some of your strategies, not for just managing the behavior of, but helping to kind of balance out the reactivity of,
Mm-hmm.
spaces where your intensity or your all or nothing is negatively impacting the space that you want to be in, you want to thrive in, or maybe even is just different than how you actually perceive yourself to be. So how do you balance out that reactivity of your type structure?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm mostly in a season where I'm a full-time student, so I feel like most of my time is perceived in the classroom. But I think I'm just more aware. I think I'm actually aware sometimes, which is a really hard truth for me, which I just named a second ago, is that I don't always really like to connect with everybody in the room. Like I like my own space. I have been thinking a lot. Abby knows this, but I do a lot of somatic work, and even thinking about how my face structure probably looks a way that I don't want to connect, and like being more aware that when I'm like actually wanting to engage, even somatically, my face will, look differently and kind of that how to. So I feel like I'm more in that season of like, I'm very aware that the way I'm perceived by people, like I'm like, I notice when I look at pictures, I do look really upset. Like, I'm like, but it's a weird dichotomy too, because I'm like, it's just not who I am though. It's not the same. And so I think that I find myself not with necessarily strategies, because as you know, the more work you do, it feels like you get to name where you're at, but you're not exactly sure like how to fix it. You're like, no, I want to get to a place where I am as an eight more soft and open and tender so that I want to connect with people and give them my time and be willing to take the time to connect with somebody that I've already maybe as an eight decided I haven't wanted to connect with. And so I think some of that strategy is more in my own willingness to be open and innocent and be like, this person maybe has something to teach me. And maybe you should move towards them instead of away from them. And so I feel like it's that constant really moves for me more like, do I want to connect with this person and offer them myself, or do I want to continue to not show up fully and not be completely present? I think that is probably what's going on. Now, if I do it, who knows? But at least that's kind of the awareness that I'm in the season is like, oh, I I think some people, I'm like, you go in a room and want to connect with everybody, like, absolutely. I'm like, why? So I think even in that type, just realizing we're all wired and sometimes to be like, I don't have to. So there's always that tension. I think you live in that self-awareness where you're aware of how you're perceived by other people and wanting to be most genuine. Like I want to appear to my colleagues and to new spaces as my most genuine self. And so sometimes that means that I have to really show up differently or try to show up differently. So yeah, so I feel like I'm aware of all those things
Hmm.
and always doing it sometimes and being like, I'm really tired today. I'm
Yeah.
going to not do that. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think it's helpful even just naming, if you are honest with yourself, there are
Mm-hmm.
spaces where you actually are not interested in connecting. And I know that it sounds like a simple statement, but I think even hearing you say that, I'm like, that's so helpful to name because I think also part of that type 8 structure is that, for me, I will explain why other people are making it hard for me to be vulnerable, right? Like why, there's the power dynamic is not in my favor, or
Uh-huh.
there's something about this that others are making it
Mm-hmm.
hard for me, or they're going to take advantage of me, right? But it is very other focused of why I can't be vulnerable and open.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think even just naming in the moment of like, this is actually just a space where I'm not interested in connecting, and there could be lots of reasons for that. Of like, I'm too
Mm-hmm.
tired. I'm more focused on parenting than relationing,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's some sense of like just naming of like, I'm actually just not. I'm not at a good headspace for this right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and for me, so much of that I think also, and I feel like it's tied around my like social instinct being my blind spot. Where do you know what your instinctual stacking is?
Yes, I'm a social eight.
Okay, so social aid. Okay, so I
Mm-hmm.
wondered if some of that, because I think so much of my, the like silence of my impact in a silent moment having
Mm-hmm.
that intensity having an impact. It shows up often in social dynamics where like I feel awkward, and so it's
Mm-hmm.
coming up of very closed and guarded, and so then no one else is going to welcome me into the space because
Yep.
it's intimidating and it's intense.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
the other part that you mentioned though was, when you first were discovering and kind of giving some language for it, was kind of the idea around the impulsivity of the type structure.
Hmm.
Will you say more of like how that showed up for you, and what some of the awareness was around that piece as you were giving some language to your type
Hmm.
structure?
Yes. So funny when you've been doing this work for like, what was it back then? I think that one took me a while. I would have never really considered myself an impulsive person. I think actually wasn't until I did language around the Enneagram that maybe I realized I was. And even the Enneagram passion is lust. And I'm like, whatever, like that sounds lusty. Like, I don't know. It's like, whatever. But it wasn't until we did the narrative tradition. It's that, that thing to get it out and do it very quickly and so I was like, oh my gosh, like, and because we're body types, we feel that so viscerally and how quickly I am to just need, in seasons to have my feeling and what I feel justified in and get it out very quickly. And then I think the naming within Enneagram language was some of the first, which then made me realize I was impulsive. And as I began to do that really painful slow burn work of self-awareness where you're like, okay, like I did do that very quickly and I didn't really like use my brain or pause before I did it. And so I think as I've gained some of that even somatic awareness of how you become more self-aware and try to create pause, then I've been able to like make a decision to choose if I'm going to. And then also, I think relationships always help you. Like if a lot of that impulsivity is around anxious attachments and realizing like my anxiety actually is what's causing me to be very quick with the things that I do. And bosses, I think, told me that like pretty much everybody in my life was like, how do you not know that you're impulsive? I was like, I don't know. I just, you know, as you can tell, I talk fast too. So everything I do is fast. Like eights are just very fast humans. Like we think fast, we make decisions fast, we make judgments fast, like everything we do, and then we just move on. And which is really hard for people because we can also move on very quickly. And so I think it was the painful listening of other people in my life being like, oh no, you're very, very impulsive, Alicia. I'm like, well, why? That's not wrong. It's like kind of that classic undoing of like, oh, this isn't necessarily a good thing. But now, further on, I'm like, I think I'm getting better. Like like don't send the email very quickly, and I don't post something on social media. Like I have found when I have waited and paused what benefit that is to me and everyone else around me. So,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it's an interesting one for us eights, and it's also, I don't know if it's the same for you, but it's so embodied in us. Like it feels like everything in us will implode unless we offload it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if everybody realizes that when we're being impulsive, it's just it needs to get like out of my system. So sometimes I'm like, our text friends that will deal with my intensity, or other people that won't be impacted by it, but I can still find a space that's maybe healthier to offload it. So I'm much more aware of how I offload my anxiety and my impulsivity if I need to do it, if I need to get the energy out.
Yeah, for sure. When I think even, I mean that visceral reaction, like the
Hmm.
feeling, like that
Hmm.
somatic felt sense of this has to be done or taken care of.
Hmm.
And I think, I mean, it took me so long to realize that there was a somatic profile to that intensity. And I,
Hmm.
and that was thanks to the narrative Enneagram integrating
Hmm.
like somatic work into Enneagram knowledge.
Hmm.
But before, I mean, it's the same for me of like, it just felt like this is just the way I am. And also, there are lots of, even when I teach in corporate settings, there's actually a lot of spaces where quick decision making is essential, right? And so
Absolutely.
it's kind of this neutral quality of like it just is. It can be used as a
Hmm.
benefit, or it can get really excessive, and it can be a total hindrance
Hmm.
or a total rubbing point or blind spot.
Hmm.
And I think even in my own experience, hearing you reflect on like so much of this shows up in relationships, like people mirroring back to you, whether that is supervisors or even friends of like, that was quick. Like, I didn't even know we were making this decision. And now you're like 7 steps down, the decision
Hmm.
train.
Hmm.
And starting to
Hmm.
realize like, oh, that's not how everyone is wired. And there's a
Hmm.
lot of benefit in for me, it's always the two pieces of slowing down and checking in with people. Like, neither of those are my natural orientation. And so my
Hmm.
intensity will propel me forward. And so if I can
Hmm.
create enough pause to invite myself to like slow down, even if it feels
Hmm.
like arbitrary, of like I'm giving myself 3 days to make this decision, even though I'm like, it's not going to change, but I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like 3 days to let it hit me and to let it land. Um,
Hmm.
but then also even just seeing how other people would make that decision or they would go about it and
Hmm.
realizing, like there's 8 other ways that someone would do this and that I'm missing
Hmm.
because I'm
Hmm.
geared towards this one direction.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's so hard to pause because, um, surprise, but eights don't really like to change their minds. Like, and that's which is why I think the quick decision is really good in the ways that we're natural leaders, but it's also ways that we just leave people behind. And I think that what has helped me actually the most significantly is have a pretty significant relationship in my life where there are five, and so like I could make the decision in literally a day, and they need 3 months, and so it is like okay, so that is like there are people in your life that make you have to slow down because what kind of person are you if you can't have people come along with you?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's at stake for eight sometimes is we can do it and we might even be right, but we do it alone and we don't do it in collaboration. And it's always that side of if we can learn to be patient and slow down and collaborate. And there's times where we just need to make the decision and move on. But I think we can be really lonely because we just plow forward and don't bring people we really deeply care about along with us because we weren't able to pause long enough to hear what they had to say or be
Mm-hmm.
patient for their process, that like you
Yeah.
said, there's 8 other ways that people make decisions and some of them take 3 months, why? I don't know, but like it's painful, but it's also like good. Like it's where all of the types we're integrating and learning to move forward is so helpful. Because none of us want to go at it alone. But I
Mm-hmm.
feel like eights, if we do it so quickly, we will do it alone,
Mm-hmm.
which is the sad or one of the shadows, I think, of where we can land as leaders for sure.
Yeah,
So
for sure. Well, and I think too, in my experience, both like personally, but then just working with eights, I think oftentimes what feels like this travesty on the outside is
mm-hmm.
there's so many moments when you are slowly leaving people behind and you are slowly
Mm-hmm.
choosing to be a lone ranger, but often you
Mm-hmm.
don't realize like how much you've done that
Mm-hmm.
until you're completely alone and things feel
Mm-hmm.
really irreparable at that point, right? Of
Yeah.
like and then that friend is gone, or you've been pushed out of that job, or people have quit and they
Mm-hmm.
don't want to follow you anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's so hard because there's lots of little warning signs along the way.
Mm-hmm.
But that type 8 structure is also pretty good at filtering out all those pieces with that, denial
A
defense
denial.
mechanism, which is,
Uh-huh.
and it helped when we were little, but now it's a pain in the butt.
It's also like I find denial so tricky, especially in a season I'm having to make a lot of decisions. And I'm like, am I just in denial? Like, I'm always so paranoid because you can't actually see denial. Like, it's not repressing something. It's like you literally just don't allow it to be in your like ability to see it. And so it's a really terrifying defense mechanism because you're like, what am I actually in denial about that I have no idea? Which is why it's great to live in community with people that love you and care about you. That can help you not
Mm-hmm.
live in denial. So
Yeah, for sure. But even that, right? Like, I mean, that what a healthy perspective that is, or balanced perspective. I know the healthy and unhealthy is like sometimes not such great language, but what a
yeah.
balanced perspective of
Mm-hmm.
knowing like here is a piece of my type structure. I have awareness around it and know that
Mm-hmm.
like it's really tricky. In the same way for all the 9 types, like there's parts of our type, whether that's a defense mechanism or another piece, that is just so tricky that it feels very
Mm-hmm.
hard to see outside of
Mm-hmm.
allowing other people to be a mirror back to
Mm-hmm.
you in that
Mm-hmm.
community.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I think not that you like need to like live in fear of like what am I denying today, but I remember someone even around this conversation of like curiosity of the feeling of being wrong feels exactly
Mm-hmm.
the same as being right until you realize
Mm-hmm.
you're
Of
wrong. Then it feels
course.
terrible. But all of
Mm-hmm.
those months and days and minutes where you felt like this is the right thing, it feels
Mm-hmm.
exactly the same as
Mm-hmm.
being right. And so
Mm-hmm.
she, when someone was talking through this with me, she made the comment of like, I like live in fear of like, what am I wrong about today that I have absolutely
Yeah.
no idea. And she's like, she
Mm-hmm.
was joking about it, but I think it feels similar with 8s of like, what am I completely missing that like
Mm-hmm.
in a year from now will be like a part of my like mental testimony of like, and that was the thing, right? But it's like,
What are
unless
you
you
being
have,
counseling for later?
yes, right, but unless you have some community around you, which is
Mm-hmm.
for even as a social eight, it's still hard because there's that
Mm-hmm.
essential piece of vulnerability that just feels like
Mm-hmm.
kryptonite. Like it just is
Mm-hmm.
so challenging. And so
Mm-hmm.
unless you have that
Yep.
community around you, like you go it alone and you get
Mm-hmm.
slowly less and less people with you
Mm-hmm.
until you know you wake up and kind
Yep.
of look around and realize a lot of people kind of got
Mm-hmm.
left behind.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, the you mentioned kind of the like lust of an eight. I think this is always a helpful piece to talk about because for me, I did not resonate with that language at all. And even someone talking about the like lust for intensity. I remember the first time I heard that, and I told my husband, I was like, I don't lust for intensity. I just am intense and I can't help it. And he's like, I think that's what they're talking about. Um, but
You're
but
like, oh, yeah, yeah.
yeah. So just in your process as you're kind of coming across that like that passion of lust and trying to make sense of it, like how did you notice that showing up in your experience and some of the growth that came out of from that awareness?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I think the wording is like my need to get it done now is probably when I began to think about the way I navigated relationships and control and walking into a room, like everything really is like I need to move it and impact it and do it so quickly in a way that's just done. And
Mm-hmm.
it actually is pretty much everywhere. um, just in that sense that I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. It is just this like thirst to need everything at the moment, like right now. And
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing how if you allow yourself to observe yourself, of course, with radical kindness, of course, um, that you find that, man, everywhere I look, I'm really trying to just offload this very quickly. And so I feel like I can't think of anything that comes to specifically mine, but I feel like it kind of just shows up everywhere. It is
Yeah.
it's why we make big impact. It's like why we're impulsive. I think it's why we're intimidating. Like everything is just so fast, so intense. So like I just want the nicest thing now. Like I don't want to wait later or buy it now. everything, delayed gratification is just not something that we value really at all. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting place to kind of put your self-awareness around.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think even I'm probably not going to say this back, but like the thirst for it being done right now,
Hmm.
I think that is like helpful language because even for me, there'll be times when I will become suddenly aware that I'm rushing. And then I will
Hmm.
like logically think about why am I rushing right now? And I'm like, I have
Hmm.
literally no reason. Especially, I feel like I've had seasons of life where it was like this is hustle, right? Like it's a
Oh
nine to
yeah,
five
absolutely.
with emergency response after hour. Like it's like there's just a lot, and like I'm juggling kids and all the things.
Hmm.
But in recent years, when I switched into Enneagram work as my central work, I have a lot more time where it's almost like I'm stay home parenting. Like
Hmm.
I'm off and on between like I'm in my work and no, I'm really just home. Like I don't need to wear my
Hmm.
entrepreneur hat now and as part of my like
Hmm.
boundaries.
Hmm.
But I'm still rushing. Like even though there's
Hmm.
nothing that really needs to get done other than like we're just spending time together. Like we're just playing
Hmm.
right now. I will still have this intensity around like crossing things off the list or like needing to go somewhere every day.
Hmm.
And that's how less often shows up for me too, because
Hmm.
self-pres is dominant for me. So like spending money is a hard, like my eightness doesn't show up with a lot of the like this has to,
Hmm.
buying the
Grandier.
nice or the best. Yes. That, for better, for worse, it doesn't show up that way. But I will feel so much, that intensity and even like you said talking quickly, that's always my thing, but even just moving quickly of like, gosh, why are
Hmm.
you rushing around the kitchen? Like that probably saved you 3 seconds, like three
Ah.
seconds.
Uh-huh.
And, I think it always feels like, well, I have so much energy. And so I'm moving, but it does also like it takes a toll on you to constantly move
Hmm.
as if you are outrunning a lion, like as if there's
Hmm.
enough intensity of the sky is falling and this has to happen, and not because I'm
Hmm.
even scared of anything, right? It's not like that six, like
Hmm.
I'm trying to plan for and make sure that everything's okay and we're all safe and secure. But just that compulsion towards moving so quickly, and it
Yes.
takes a toll.
Yeah, I will say my energy level for that intensity is not the same. I would say much slower by nature, actually. I was like when I'm in A panels, like Alicia's energy is like I have a very strong nine wing and social, so my energy. But I've actually what I'd be actually curious as my friend and Enneagram practitioner friend. I have noticed actually in the season of my life, I've been filled with a lot of anxiety. I moved to New York City from uprooting my life, and it has been the best decision of my life. But I have, eights tampered down so much of their emotions constantly all the time. So my friends are like, "How are you doing with your trip?" Like, I'm great. I'm moving. I moved across the country. Like, no big deal. I'm like, great. And then um, I have found like more clearly ways that showed up. And then I did this kind of cohort around anxiety of trying to figure out how, like, clearly you're anxious. Like, you have to be like you're a normal human person. All the things that you have done are like anxiety producing things. But I have noticed actually that for me, when I'm truly anxious, I actually stop. Like like it's almost that somatic freeze moment where I
Mm.
really get to where I really have a hard time moving forward. It's actually all of my energy is gone. If I'm not sure, and I think it's that I don't want to look weak, kind of coming back to that, what I'm trying to avoid. And so I've actually found for me specifically, and I'm curious if it's for you, when I'm actually truly anxious, I asked my very best friend, I'm like, what do I do when I'm anxious? She's like, you procrastinate. You like don't do anything. And I'm like, really? And I began to explore that a lot. So it's also weird to be an eight that has all this intensity and movement forward. But if I'm like truly filled with anxiety and don't know how to do something and kind of want to avoid looking weak in front of somebody or being vulnerable in front of somebody, it actually does the opposite for me. I actually just kind of get almost not depressed, but I just get to a space of like I need to pause. So does that show up
Mm-hmm.
for you, or is that just like a random Alicia eight sort of thing? I'm curious how anxiety
Yeah.
shows up for you.
No, I mean, I feel some of those things similarly. I don't know that I would have couched it as anxiety,
Mm.
but everything you're sharing, I always frame it as like my movement to five. And
Oh
so
yeah.
in this space, which it is anxiety, so this is my eightness of like, oh yeah, like I think it probably is anxiety, but it's the moment of I don't know what to do. And
Yes,
so
that's it.
yes,
Uh-huh.
it's the moment of I don't know what to do, and everything feels out of control, which is anxiety, right? So I just have
You're
not,
welcome. I named it for you.
right. Thank you. Emotions are hard.
I
No,
know.
actually, emotions are not hard.
Awesome.
My emotions are hard. Everyone else's, I feel like I have lots of space and intuition for, right? But it's like the mirror
Your
back.
own.
Yeah,
Just
that type structure.
damping it down. Yep.
Damping it down. There's that denial. But yes, but it's, and it turns very much into like my self preservation gets very excessive when I'm
Mm,
stressed. And so it turns into
mm.
learning. Like learning is my one
Oh
big
yeah.
resource
Hmm.
because I can. I can spend a lot of time doing it, but I don't have to spend always money. Sometimes I do spend money, but like,
Mm,
and
hmm.
so like reading, and I mean, I think about my first, especially semester. I always think about my life in semesters, but my first semester of starting my coaching practice and leaving my full time job, and the moments of anxiety was putting my head down and reading tons of things and listening to all the
Hmm.
podcasts and all the free resources to figure out how to be an entrepreneur. And so it
Hmm.
wasn't even like trying to finish my certification and all the Enneagram coaching pieces. It was like, how do I do marketing? How do I do my taxes? How do I do like all these
Hmm.
systems and databases? But it was
Hmm.
because I was anxious. And so it
Hmm.
was my like withdraw into five.
Yeah, I have had multiple people. I'm also a spiritual director and also trained somatically the same way that Abby is, and we have so much of the same training. But I've had people dearly close to me be like, I need you to stop taking certifications and I need you to just like do the thing that you're going to do. But I'm like, oh, but I'm like not an expert at it yet, which is funny because people are surprised that eight say that because we just assume that we felt this space. But if we generally don't actually know what we're doing, it actually shows up as, at least for me, like more insecure than you would think eights can be. That I'm like, no, it's a really big deal to do, as all of you guys know, the space of like social media marketing, trying to like, I want to have a practice, but I didn't think I was going to have to become a writer and a podcaster and a graphic designer and all these things, and it's so overwhelming. And so I've had multiple people in my life going back to that education piece, which is that five, which is also like, which is why I love to move away from unhealthy. Like I love that part of me that's a five that moves more
Mm-hmm.
pensive and like does research, but it has also been like you should just do the thing that you actually have plenty of knowledge and expertise in and just hone in on that. And I'm like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you know. So
Yeah,
I'm
for
almost feel like I've
sure.
been banned by my friends. Like you're not allowed to do another certification. Like you just need to just, you're going to do good, like, you know, but it's that weakness and vulnerability of showing that in a space that's really challenging. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
For
it's just
sure.
a, and people are like, eights are that way. We're like, oh, absolutely we are.
Mm-hmm.
We are not as confident as you think we are
Yeah,
all the
for
time.
sure. For sure. And I remember even before, working in higher ed, I used to describe like I love to learn and I love new
Hmm.
things, but I hate the experience of not knowing something
Oh,
when it's required of me
yes.
to know it. And
Uh-huh.
it's like
100%.
the more that I moved up into, different positions and managerial things, there's so many spaces where it's like I like people are looking at me for answers. I'm like, I don't know this. Like I don't know this database or this
Hmm.
system, or they just changed this policy or whatever it is, right? And
Hmm.
and I think when you enter into both the Enneagram world and the somatic world, which are huge worlds, and then a
Oh.
spiritual direction for you on top of that, right? You're trying to overlap all
Hmm.
these worlds. I think also you just realize how big they are.
Hmm.
And the teachers that we are learning from, they have been doing this for decades, right? They're in
Hmm.
these more seasoned years than we are.
Hmm.
But I think also part of that self-awareness also creates so much more humility for what you don't
Hmm.
know. And it's a good thing,
Hmm.
right? Because sometimes there's like this, like, you're too confident, right? Like we need to have like a touch less of like something could go bad, like something could be really wrong
Yes.
here. And so as you become more aware, you have more of a
Hmm.
healthy awareness around like, oh, I don't know all the things, and
Hmm.
someone is far superior in their expertise, or they've had so much more time or experience.
Hmm.
And so it's like a good thing that there's way more humility around your ability. There's
Hmm.
not blind self-assurance,
Hmm.
but it can definitely pull you into that five space where you just keep learning, and it
Uh-huh.
feels
Yep.
really hard to. And sometimes I'm
Get
like, I
out of
feel
that.
like it's like out of my respect for that, I like out of my respect for somatic work and out of my respect for the Enneagram, it's like hard to even step into some of these realms where you need to be the expert. But there are times when I'm being honest with myself, like it actually is just anxiety. It's my
No, absolutely. It's a hundred
like
percent.
spinning
Yeah.
my wheels, yeah, in my five space.
Yeah. My friends are like, you have like legit certifications. Like there are a ton of people that show up in spaces that say what they know and have none of the actual training you have, you know? And so it's like just owning also what you do know. And it's such a, and I don't know if that's different for females entrepreneurs. Like I think there is this space even that is challenging for some reason for women more. I feel like men do it sometimes so much more naturally and easily sometimes, but I find myself as a woman being like, why is it hard for me to charge for my things? Or, you know, and it's just a new space to enter into, which is also really exciting to get
Mm-hmm.
to operate and move in new spaces. So
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, so I know that we could talk forever, but
Of
we
course.
won't because we're only
And
talking
very
about AIDS.
quickly.
I know, right? It always comes to the end quickly. But I
Yeah.
do want to give some space just for you to share about the work that you're doing. So I know that
Yeah.
you are already have some certifications and are still in the middle of learning, which I feel like is always true. Like we're always
Hmm.
learning in the middle
Hmm.
of coaching and teaching and in the practices that we do. But what is your work in the world? How can people be connected to the work that you do
Yeah.
and some of those pieces?
So yeah, I'm a spiritual director, which is a really complicated field to talk about because it's so very incredibly beautifully varied, as all spirituality is. But I joke that it's kind of like counseling for spirituality in the most basic sense. And then really just integrating the intersection of somatics and spirituality in this kind of what we're all doing at Enneagram work, which is also why I love it, is this inner knowing. Like I think so much of our culture is this outward doing, and we're constantly doing, but we've lost the art of going inward and really becoming self-aware and even attuning to our bodies and attuning to our behavior patterns. And so I really just think that we're I would love to be, I'm in a season where I want to come alongside people to help really produce true transformation as people get to know themselves and heal. Because I really do believe that the more we heal ourselves, we then actually have an appropriate place to heal our world. And I think we can definitely look in our world today and we just all need to learn how to get along better and like own our own stuff. And I don't think that happens until we get to know ourselves. And for some reason in the world that we live in now, we are not taught to know ourselves. We are told to do. And so I'm hoping to continue to be in space and just helping people kind of attune to that interior world that is, for most of us, we've never even thought about it. And Enneagram is my favorite tool for naming all of that. And then I think, honestly, no matter what tradition or faith you come from, all interior work is spiritual, and all transformation at the end of the day is spiritual. And so just hoping to be in that space and helping people kind of grow and move towards that.
Yeah, no, I love
So yeah.
that. What's the best way for people to find you and to connect to your work?
Yeah, so I think the most clearest place is my website, which is somatic-spirituality.com. I do have social media, but as we've talked about, I'm fairly new and a student, so I'm like trying to add in all this space. So it is, I show up there when I can, but my website is great. It has a lot of my somatic work and Enneagram work and also spiritual direction on there as well. So that is the clearest and easiest way to find me. So
Okay, perfect. Well, and
yeah,
I
thank
will
you.
link that in the show notes to make it easy.
Perfect. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast, for sharing conversation with me. It also, as I've gone through all the numbers, you're our final number for the series. You're my only eight that I got to like bounce back and
Yeah.
forth with,
Of course.
and so I think in so many ways there have been these moments of just like kindred spirits, and so I thank you
Mm.
for being willing to share and to offer insight
Oh,
and
thanks.
some of your language and experience. So.
Thank you, Abby. So good to see you again, too.
Hey, Enneagram friends. Thanks for listening in to my conversation with my friend and fellow practitioner, Alicia Divers. I hope that you are taking away so many moments of truth and so much language that I think is just so helpful in articulating that type structure and just the opportunity for growth within that type structure. If you found this episode helpful, would you do me a favor and share it with a friend and subscribe to the podcast so that you could hear the rest of the episodes this season? That's a great way to share this resource and to grow the community and the conversations around the Enneagram. Okay, friends, until next time.